Good afternoon, everybody. This is your teacher, Mr. Reagan, for Troup County High School, World History. And I am real quickly going to narrate through a PowerPoint to help you guys with some supplemental information about the Age of Revolutions to help you with your projects coming up. So I'll try to make this as expedient as possible and not take up too much of your time. Like I said, we're talking about the Age of Revolutions, specifically today about the revolutions in England. And this is straight from our Georgia Standards of Excellence for world history in the state of Georgia. We are obviously living in Georgia, and you can see it pointing to us. That's where we are. And we are speaking today about England and its moderately slow transition from being an absolute monarchy, which we have gone into detail about in our last module, to more of a constitutional monarchy, leading to the democracy that we have over here today. So specifically, I want you guys to analyze how the revolutions of England impacted revolutions not only here in America, but the creation of our Constitution and democracy. So we're going to start by talking about the predecessor to Elizabeth I, who we obviously learned about in our previous unit. And James I is the predecessor in the early part of the 17th century. He believed strongly in the theory of divine right, meaning he believed that his power came directly from God and he only answered to God. This led him to clash with Parliament, the legislative body in England, and he truly believed that he did have complete authority and that the government, the parliament, and the people should bend to his will as he knew best since he gained his power from God. After James I, we got his son, King Charles I. He was James I's successor. He too believed in strongly in the theory of divine right, and by this time the people had sort of had enough of it. So they forced Charles I to sign a petition of right in 1628, a formal document that would limit the king's power. And even though he signed it, he continued to ignore it. And he would go on to dissolve Parliament in 1629 as they had tried to limit his power. In the petition of right, there were several demands, like, for example, free men should not be forced to pay any tax unless it was in accordance to an act of parliament, meaning the king couldn't tax the people, only parliament could. No free men should be imprisoned contrary to the laws of the land. Basically, that's habeas corpus, the idea that you should have a trial by jury, and you can't just be thrown in prison on a whim because the king is upset with you. And also that soldiers and sailors should not be quartered on private persons, which obviously is going to have a direct influence on the American Revolution when we talk about the Quartering Act and the reinstatement of private citizens having no no legal right to turn soldiers away. So some of the causes of the English revolutions is that Charles sought to impose Catholicism back over the Church of England, as he was a Catholic when the rest of England had become Protestant after Henry VIII's creation of the Church of England and divorce of the Catholic Church. There's also this new group known as the Puritans, who strongly opposed Catholicism and saw Charles's actions as very dangerous and offensive to God as he was forcing Catholicism back into England. So let's talk a little bit about a Puritan leader named Oliver Cromwell. In 1642, he is going to basically have enough of Charles I in this divine right and the forcing of Catholicism, and he is going to lead an open rebellion against the king. This is going to basically be a civil war, a revolution. And as you can tell by the scowling face of this man, Oliver Cromwell was quite an unpleasant man. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. We're going to skip our reviews as you can answer those on your own. So the result of this English Revolution, at least the English Civil War, the first one, is that they overthrow and they execute Charles I. He is beheaded by the Puritans. Cromwell then assumes leadership, basically naming himself as the leader of the country. He gives himself a title tell you about and expect in a second. And he one of Cromwell's first actions is to expel members of Parliament that opposed his actions, which sounds a little bit like a dictatorship. And even though he was never really called a dictator, you could certainly make some correlations there for Oliver Cromwell. He's not going to be the greatest leader England's ever had, that's for sure. So Parliament gets dissolved. Oliver Cromwell becomes the Lord Protector of England, and he is going to basically rule as a dictator until his death in 1658. Before I talk about the Restoration, people were very unhappy with Cromwell's leadership. The Puritans were strictly religious and basically forced their viewpoints on the rest of England. Essentially, a Puritan belief is almost the belief that if you are happy, you are sinning. And Cromwell went as far as even basically outlawing the celebration of Christmas in any fun way that people became so unhappy with him, they decided that enough was enough. And after his death, they didn't want to continue to live under the Puritan leadership. And they realized that if they were going to get a change, then their best option was to reach out back to the family of the English monarch and to restore, hence the Restoration, the monarchy in England to get rid of Puritan leadership. So after Cromwell, there's going to be a reestablishment of the monarchy in England in 1659 with Charles I's son, Charles II. And the main reason he was invited back is because Charles II, getting some water here. Unlike his father, was not Catholic. He was a Protestant of the Church of England. So Parliament, during this Restoration, some of the deals, Parliament had to approve all taxes, which is something they wanted anyways. And the king had to recognize that he needed Parliament's consent to carry out his decisions. So Charles II becomes the king. Parliament gets a little more power, and the power of Charles II is slightly limited, meaning he can't really do whatever he wants. Parliament is making a lot of the decisions for him and approving his decisions. Sorry, I've got something stuck in my throat. Let's continue here. All right, so after Charles II, we get a new king, and King James II. He's going to precede Charles II. In 1685, he becomes the king. He was the younger brother of Charles II. He, unfortunately, is a Catholic, and he is viewed as a threat by the Anglican Church, the Protestants of England. However, they tolerated him as the king because he had no male heir. And many believe that after he died, one of his daughters would become the next Queen of England, which would have been good for them because the daughters were all Protestant. However, a travesty is going to occur because James II's wife is going to eventually give birth to a son, and obviously the son will be like James II. I said James I, excuse me, James II, and be a Catholic. The Protestant leaders invited James's son-in-law in response to this, William of Orange, and his James II's daughter to invade England from the Netherlands and to assume the throne as Protestant leaders of England. They did not want to continue under the Catholic James II. So this is the Glorious Revolution. It's referred to the Glorious Revolution for the lack of bloodshed. There was very little. And it was also a successful one as William of Orange and his wife Mary, the daughter of James II, are going to raise an army and land in England in 1688 with the support of most of England, the Parliament, and the Church. And James II is going to be forced to flee to France. It was either stay and try to fight off what his daughter and son-in-law, or keep his head and live out the rest of his days in France, which is what he chose to do. So he surrendered the throne without a fight. William and Mary assumed leadership in England. They obviously need the support of Parliament, so they agree to give more power to the legislature and accept an English Bill of Rights, thus making England a constitutional monarchy, essentially. This English Bill of Rights is going to be passed down in 1689. It increases the power of the Parliament, and it limits the power of the king. It granted freedom of worship to Puritans while continuing to limit the right of Catholics, which is something many people in England were fond of. And it ripped apart the belief of divine right of kings. That was